Okay, well, welcome to the sixth episode where we talk about the applications of the principle of utility. So let's go straight to what Bentham has to say about this. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong; on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. And not only is that a rather wonderful passage in terms of its prose, but it really captures everything that we need to talk about in this episode. The key point and the key thing, one of the key things I want you to take from this is to see the connection between the prescriptive and the predictive in Bentham's thought. The prescriptive is about what you should do, it's prescribing, telling you what to do, and the predictive is to predict what people will do. It's the same principle applies to both, according to Bentham. The principle of utility both predicts how people will behave and prescribes how they ought to behave. How does he put it? It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we should do. Okay. So basically Bentham's position is this. First of all, he says that people will act to maximize their own happiness. That is, remember, pleasure over pain. The most amount of pleasure, the least amount of pain. That's how people will act. That's a predictive thesis. It predicts how people will behave. It's a psychological thesis. And its name is psychological hedonism. That's the first half of the thesis. The second half is that people should act so as to maximize the happiness of everyone. That's what's known as normative. That's not a psychological thesis, it's a normative thesis. Normative just means having to do with norms or standards of conduct. So shoulds, oughts, permissions, obligations, duties, rights, these are all norms. So this half of the thesis, the half that has to do with prescribing what people should do, that's not a psychological thesis, it's a normative thesis. It's a moral thesis, and the name of that is ethical hedonism. So there's two different theses here. There's the psychological hedonism, which is about predicting what people will do, and there's the ethical hedonism, which is about prescribing what people should do. Now, on the face of it, you might think that these theses are in tension. That is, in particular, what's the point of the ethical hedonism given the psychological hedonism? Let me spell that out. If Bentham is telling us that people are going to act to maximize their own happiness, what's the point of telling them that they should act in order to maximize everybody's happiness? What's the point of it? I mean, if people are bound, hardwired to act to maximize their own happiness, then what's the point in telling them that they should do something different, maximize the happiness of everybody? You're just telling them that they should do something that no one's going to do. So it's all pointless. Left alone, that is, people will simply pursue their own happiness. But, Bentham says, the role of government is to ensure that the happiness of the individual is linked to the happiness of everyone. So the role of government is to make sure that people's individual happiness calculations, utility calculations, produce utility for everybody. And how will it do that? Well, there are two general ways in which the government can do that. One, the most important way, is to discourage what we might describe as antisocial behavior by linking pain with it. So if I act in a way that everything else being equal benefits me, but only me, then the government can inflict pain on me, and as a result, it will no longer be in my self-interest to act that way. I will act differently. In effect, the job is to punish me for behaviour that harms the utility of other people. The other way is to encourage social behaviour by incentivising it, although Bentham's actually more interested in the punishment than the incentivising good behaviour. Okay, so let's just take an example. Let's say that I'm the kind of person that likes, I'm a bit of a sadist, say, and I enjoy inflicting pain on other people. Now, what Bentham is saying is that as a psychological thesis, we'll predict that if that's the kind of person I am, that's what I'll do. I'll go around inflicting pain on other people because it maximizes my personal happiness. Okay? And there's no point telling me, but Alan, you should act to maximize the happiness of everybody, because I just won't do it, right? I'm hardwired to act to maximize my own happiness, says Bentham. Okay, but then Bentham says the job then of government is to come along and punish me if I act in a way that harms other people. And if we set up a system like that, it will deter me from acting in such a way. And so I'll come to recognize that it is no longer a good way of maximizing my happiness to go out and harm other people. Okay, on its own, with no government, yes, that's what I would do. I would go out and harm other people because it would maximize my happiness. But given that there are, for example, laws in place that will mean that I'll get punished if I do that, I won't do it, right? Because I come to recognize in a society like that, that maximizing my happiness cannot be achieved by harming other people. So the job of government is to create laws, for example, that will produce maximum happiness by incentivizing people to act in such a way. That is, in such a way that they realize utility for the whole society, realize happiness for the whole society. And you achieve this through a kind of group coordination. This is sometimes called the war financing problem or the prisoner's dilemma problem, and we need to look at that now. Now, this can be pretty hard to get your head around, especially in this sort of format. The best thing to do is just to get the slide and look at it and sort of try and figure it out. But the way it works is this. There's two people, prisoner A and B, who have committed a crime, and for which they would get 3 years. But the 3 years in prison, the 3 years, a sentence of 3 years for. However, the prosecutors don't have enough evidence against them to convict them. They only have enough evidence to convict them for a lesser charge that would only get them 1 year. And so the prosecutors are trying to get the prisoners to cooperate with them. That is, to cooperate with the prosecutors, not to cooperate with each other, right? They're keeping the prisoners separate so that the prisoners can't cooperate with each other. They can't, make a plan for what they're going to do. So the deal is, if you cooperate with us, we'll give you a year's reduction to your sentence. Okay. All right. So what follows from this is this. We just go through the possibilities at the top of the slide here. If A and B each betray the other, each of them will serve 2 years in prison, right? Because if they each cooperate with the authorities, with the police, let's just call it the police. If they cooperate with the police, they'll each get convicted for the crime that carries a sentence of 3 years, but they'll get a 1 year reduction for cooperating. Right? If A betrays B, but B remains silent, A will be set free. See, that's part of the deal, and B will serve 3 years in prison. Right? There'll be enough information, enough evidence there to convict B. But if A and B both remain silent, they don't cooperate at all, then they'll serve 1 year in prison. Okay, and we imagine A and B in their separate cells thinking about what they should do. Now, first of all, let's imagine prisoner A sitting in a cell, and he thinks, well, what should I do? Well, let's imagine if prisoner B, my mate, let's imagine that my mate doesn't cooperate. Right? Let's imagine that he keeps silent. Well, then, if I don't testify against him, I'll go to prison for 1 year. Whereas if I testify against him, I'll get off scot-free. Okay, so in that case, it's better that I testify. Okay, now imagine that my mate testifies. Okay, and if he testifies and I don't testify, then I'll get 3 years in prison, right? Whereas if I do testify, then I'll get 2 years in prison. Okay, so it's better if I testify. Okay, so either way, whether my mate testifies or not, it's better that I testify. I'll be better off if I testify. Okay, so I'm going to testify, and prisoner A testifies. And then we imagine that prisoner B does exactly the same thing. Right? Goes through exactly the same reasoning, and prisoner B testifies. So they both testify. Now, the result is, right, that they both get 2 years in prison. It would have been much better if neither of them had testified, much better for them. If neither of them had testified, then they would have only got 1 year in prison. Okay, now as I say, that can be difficult to work through, but the idea is just sit there in front of this slide and keep thinking about it, and you'll get there. You'll see the point if you haven't already. Now, what this prisoner's dilemma shows is a very interesting thing. It's that, at least in situations like this, when people calculate to act in their self-interest, they end up not acting in their self-interest. Okay? A and B try to work out what's in their self-interest and they act accordingly. But it would actually have been in their self-interest not to work out what was in their self-interest, but just to cooperate. And that's a sort of a paradox. The suggestion is that it's actually quite common. So it's kind of a bit artificial in that example that we were just looking at. But there are suggestions that this is actually very common, that life's often like this, that if you calculate what's in your self-interest, you'll end up actually damaging your self-interest. It's best just to cooperate. And here are just some examples. I didn't think of these. I just sort of looked it up on the Google. No, what would it have been? Wikipedia or something, to find out some examples that people give. And here are some. I'm not very impressed with all of them myself, but here are some that you might think about. One would be nations stockpiling nuclear weapons. Okay, it would be better if we just all cooperated and got rid of them, but that's not what happens. I'm worried that you've got them, so I start getting them. You're worried that I've got them, so you start getting them, and we go up and up and up and up, and we end up with an arms race, as indeed seems to be. I mean, this has been knocked off the front pages by the virus, of course, but it's nevertheless, this seems to be the way the world is currently going at the moment. It was the way the world of my youth was, and it now looks like it's the way the world is once again. Right? We're spending huge resources on developing weapons that we'd all be much better off if we could use in another way. And of course, there's also the fact that with a whole lot more weapons around, we're all in more danger from the weapons. Okay, another one would be, again, this has been knocked off the front pages lately, but nation states not restricting CO2 emissions. You know, what's the point? What's the point? It's this particular issue for people in New Zealand. What's the point in we in New Zealand trying to do anything when people in other countries are producing? You know, you get the idea. Well, it'd be better off if we all just cooperated on this, but instead, what we want is a situation. What people seem to want, what certain politicians around the world seem to want, is everybody else to make reductions, but not to make reductions themselves. It's a kind of, as a result, nobody makes reductions. There's a kind of prisoner's dilemma operating there. Another one would be athletes using performance-enhancing drugs. We'd all be better off if nobody used them, but given that he's using them, I've got to use them, right, and so on. So we get into this sort of vicious cycle, if you see a prisoner's dilemma. Overfishing would be another example. It would be better if we didn't take so many fish from the sea, because then there'd be plenty for everyone. But given that guy's taking a whole lot, I might as well take as much as I can get as well. Some people suggest, these are the ones I'm not so comfortable with. Women wearing makeup is one that's sometimes suggested. It'd be the argument being it'd be better off if women just didn't wear makeup at all. But given that some women do, it puts pressure on other women to do it and so forth. I don't know what you think about that. You make your own judgment. Other examples that people sometimes give are health independent hygiene, like shaving, deodorant, and cutting hair, and so on. I mean, I don't know about this one, but it's sometimes suggested that this is a significant. So just think about, for example, we all wear and spend quite a bit of money on deodorant, and if someone didn't, we'd be shocked. Oh, that guy stinks and whatever. But 100 years ago, people didn't wear deodorant. So what? So here's another situation where, and it's not just that people didn't, and of course there are parts of the world where people generally don't wear deodorant, and nobody in those parts of the world seems to care. Right? So we end up spending a fortune on deodorant, and really, do we really need to? Well, I need to because you are, and you need to because I am, and the suggestion is that's kind of a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, now the idea is that there's a role for government here too, and that is in situations where we would make decisions that aren't in our self-interest. We would try and pursue our self-interest, but we would in fact make decisions that damaged our self-interest. The government can step in and change things so that we make the right decisions. Now, Bentham himself thought that people were pretty poor at understanding their own desires and motivations. So think about it this way. As we saw earlier, Bentham said that there's really only one thing that motivates us in life, and that is to get pleasure. Well, pleasure over pain. It's the same single motivation. And you might say, well, no, that's not true. I'm motivated by that maybe, but I'm motivated by lots of other things as well. And Bentham is just going to say, well, no, you're not. You might think you are, but you're not. Now, that might seem a really arrogant thing to say, but there are reasons for that Bentham can give to support his view. And let's just think this through a little bit. So let me just give you an example where people think that they understand themselves, but it turns out that they don't. It's a trivial one in a way, but I think it's quite revealing. So I remember once I was out at dinner with a whole bunch of my wife's friends, and we were at a Thai restaurant, and one of my wife's friends was regaling us with how much she hated the taste of coriander. She just said she really didn't like it, and going on and on. And I asked her, she was having some soup, some tom yum goong soup, and I asked her whether she liked the soup, and she said it's fantastic, it's really, really wonderful soup. And I said, yeah, okay, but it's full of coriander, which it is. The soup would be full of coriander. And I said, I don't think you're right. I think you say you don't like it, but you're wrong. Now, she wasn't very happy with me. I was sort of doing the Bentham thing there. She wasn't very happy with me and thought I was incredibly arrogant to say this, and who was I to tell her what she liked and what she disliked. But if you think, didn't I have a point? I mean, the fact was that she was saying that she didn't like something that she was eating, and she claimed to really love the thing that she was eating. Right? Now, we can just be mistaken about our likes and dislikes. We can think we like things and be wrong, and think that we dislike things and be wrong. Right? This happens. Right? It's not very uncommon. And Bentham would say, look, if you think about things like your immune system or your digestive system, most people have no idea really how those things work, right? And why should we, but they still work, right? I mean, if a doctor says to you, well, your immune system works by, they give you a story, you don't say, well, my immune system doesn't work like that, right? You'd think that person was nuts, right? You think, yeah, it is up to experts to tell you how your immune system or digestive system works. And you're just being stupid if you get hot under the collar and say, well, mine doesn't work that way. I know my immune system better than anybody, right? You're just being stupid. And Bentham would say, well, why think any differently about the mind, right? What your deep motivations are is just as obscure to you as your immune system or your digestive system. Experts, says Bentham, are in a better position to work out what's really going on here than you are. And this leads Bentham to support a kind of technocracy, that is, rule of experts, because he believes that the experts are in a better position to work out what will make people happy than people are themselves. Now that brings us to another issue. I'm not saying you should agree with that, right? But that's Bentham's position, right? And this brings us to another issue. How is it that the experts are going to work out what it is that will bring happiness? We've seen that in theory, the principle of utility is very simple. You just maximize the amount of happiness that there is in the world. Great. But clearly, can be difficult to apply that in practice. How are we supposed to work out which actions will achieve that result? Working out just what will maximize happiness can be extremely difficult, or perhaps even impossible in certain circumstances. Now, Bentham had a reply to this. He thought that happiness could be measured using what he calls his philosophic calculus, and we can see that here in this slide. Now, sometimes it's divided up differently. Sometimes it's only 4 things or 5 or whatever, but anyway, I've got these 7, but it doesn't matter. This will do. He said there are these, happiness, pleasure and pain have these aspects: intensity, how strong the pleasure is; duration, how long the pleasure will last; certainty or uncertainty, how likely or unlikely it is that the pleasure will occur; propinquity or remoteness, how soon the pleasure will occur; fecundity, the probability that the action will be followed by sensations of the same kind; purity, the probability that it will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind; extent, how many people will be affected. Okay, so we should use these things when working out what will what we should do. So we should prefer action, other things being equal, where the pleasure is more intense than less intense, where the pleasure lasts longer, has a longer duration than otherwise, where the pleasure is more certain, where the pleasure is close or propinquitous rather than remote, where the pleasure is fecund, where the pleasure leads on to other pleasures, and where the pleasure is pure, so it doesn't lead on to pains, and where there are lots of people who will be affected. And now, Bentham really only intended this as a beginning. This was just the start, the beginning of a hedonic science, a science of pleasure. Now, Bentham lived during an age of great scientific progress. Science was discovering answers to questions that people thought would never be answered. You know, science was developing into areas where nobody thought it would exist before. And Bentham thought, well, you know, sooner or later we'll have a pleasure of science, and the philosophic calculus is a template for the kinds of questions that it should be asking. Now, it turns out that, I think Bentham probably had good reasons for believing that a science of pleasure was going to be able to be possible in the time that he wrote. And if one had developed, it would turn out, Bentham thought, that society could be run by kind of utility experts, you know, experts in happiness, experts in utility, that would make decisions about what would produce the most happiness for people. The experts, remember, being in a better position than people themselves to work out what will make them happy. Now, as I say, that this might sound completely fanciful to you. I think Bentham had some reason for believing that it was possible. Whether it was desirable or not is another matter, but Bentham had reasons for thinking that it was possible in his day, but it just hasn't worked out that way. Okay, it turns out that we haven't developed a science of happiness. It's proven to be far too difficult, and it doesn't look like we'll ever be able to produce one. Okay, well, so much the worse for Bentham, but Bentham also had a substitute. He said, there's something else that we can use that is a proxy for happiness. It's not happiness itself, it's not perfect, but it's a proxy. And that thing is money. Okay, so if you think about it, says Bentham, you can tell what makes me happy by looking at how I spend my money, because I spend my money on the things that makes me happy. And what's more, if you look at how I actually choose to spend my money, that'll be a bit more accurate guide. No, it's not perfect, but it will be a more accurate guide to what makes me happy than asking me what makes me happy, you know, because I, as it were, put my money where my mouth is when I spend money. Okay, it also helps to estimate the intensity of my pleasures, because I'm prepared to spend more for things that bring me more pleasure. Okay, so now Bentham recognizes that money, you know, a science of money, is not perfect for tracking happiness, but he thinks it's a pretty good substitute if we don't have, as we don't, a science of happiness. Okay, now you might think about this now this way. Bentham thought we were going to have a science of happiness, and these happiness experts were going to run the world. Well, rubbish, Bentham, that didn't happen. But hang on a minute, he also thought that we could use money as a proxy for happiness, and that there would be experts in money, and that they would run the world. Now, how fanciful is that? You might think that that's actually pretty close to what does happen, that we have a science of money, it's called economics, and you might well argue that economists run the world, at least to a certain degree. Okay, now one thing that's very important and is a real problem for Bentham is that Bentham's system can work only if it's possible to make interpersonal judgments, that is, comparisons between people. You have to be able to compare. I mean, if you and I are both hungry and there's only one apple, right? Bentham's position is you give the apple to the person who'll get the most pleasure from it. Okay, well, we can only do that if we can work out who will get the most pleasure. So we have to be able to make an interpersonal comparison. We have to be able to compare what your pleasure of eating the apple would be with my pleasure of what eating the apple would be. We have to be able to compare your pleasure with mine. We have to make these interpersonal judgments. We have to be able to trade off one person's happiness with another person's happiness. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to use the principle of utility to make policy. Perhaps very soon we won't have to utilise this principle actually to make policy, because maybe in the not too distant future we'll be able to insert little chips into people's heads that will be able to read people's brain waves and determine and determine the amount of pleasure that they're experiencing, so on. And maybe we could feed all this back to a central computer in our capital cities, and all the data could be collected, and then the experts could crunch the data and come up with a system for maximizing utility. And it looks as if, on Bentham's approach, if we can do it, we should do it. Now that all might immediately make you ask, has something gone wrong here? Does that sound like the ideal society? A society where we all have little chips embedded in our heads, where all our thoughts and feelings are being beamed down to, in my case, down to Wellington, where utility experts are making decisions about how my life should go? Well, we'll come back to this, but this looks as if to be the world in which the world that Bentham was recommending. Anyway, what we've done in this episode is we've looked at how the principle of utility is meant to be applied. What we're going to do in the next episode is look at some implications and problems with this.